On page 40 in the Malcolm Gladwell book Outliers, he wrote, "In fact, researchers have settled on what they believe is the magic number for true expertise, 10,000 hours. Firstly, that's not true. It wasn't a fact, it isn't a fact, and we could call it a lie. Secondly, the research that Malcolm Gladwell references is from deliberate practice, but he doesn't actually reference deliberate practice in the book, only the quantity of hours. And the third thing, which I find the most interesting, in the first chapter of this book, talking about deliberate practice, Malcolm Gladwell apparently apologized to Anders Ericsson, the lead author or lead researcher in deliberate practice at the time, and saying, "I'm sorry," inside of a symposium for what he said about deliberate practice and the 10,000 hour rule. See, the original research wasn't directed at the amount of hours to become an expert, it was challenging the assumption that you could be naturally talented or whether you develop skills over time, the nature versus nurture debate, and that is why they were measuring the amount of hours it was taking for experts to become experts in what? Violin and piano. Their focus on deliberate practice, not hours practiced. They describe deliberate practice is a highly structured activity, the explicit goal of which is to improve performance. Specific tasks are invented to overcome weaknesses, and performance is carefully monitored to provide cues for ways to improve it further. We claim that deliberate practice requires effort and is not inherently enjoyable. Individuals are motivated because practice improves performance. In addition, engaging in deliberate practice generates no immediate monetary rewards and generates costs associated with access to teachers and training environments. But despite that statement, a lot of research that happened afterwards that were looking into deliberate practice seemed to move away from those elements and directed their research towards the hours practiced. Anders Ericsson focused on three other things inside of deliberate practice: the effort of the participant to engage in the practice. The activity should also be relevant to the overall performance improvement, not just do practice. But also, which is interesting, the practice should be enjoyable during the engagement. So it's not inherently enjoyable, but the longer term process is enjoyable, which relates to the 11 fun tenets I mentioned in the previous video summarizing the Mr. Sports Coaching book. Fun. In the Mr. Sports Coaching book and the original studies by Anders Ericsson, they talk about solitary practice, not deliberate practice, solitary practice, so practicing the skill on their own. Remember, this is violin and piano. But they go on to say deliberate practice is more than just solitary practice. When we consider team sports or team activities, you need other people involved, and that also increases engagement. So when we think about individual skills in groups, so I coach trampoline as a group, 2 or 3 around a trampoline, or in school where you've got 3 or 4 around in a table, working together towards a collective goal or collective improvement of individual skills, it can increase engagement inside of the practice. But a lot of the replication studies were focused on the quantity of hours, which I feel is where Malcolm Gladwell focused his attention. If there's lots of papers focusing on the amount of hours that people are practicing, rather than the specifics of what deliberate practice actually encompasses, it can be understood why the hours was the focus inside of the Outliers book. But as Anders Ericsson said in 2013, deliberate practice isn't a silver bullet. It's not about out-practicing your opponents. He writes in a guest post titled "The Danger of Delegating Education to Journalists." The 10,000 hour rule was invented by Malcolm Gladwell. I feel that's him showing his intent to separate deliberate practice from the 10,000 hour rule. They're not the same thing. But around the time of Anders Ericsson's passing, David Epstein wrote something really interesting about the deliberate practice work. He talks about the average hours being somewhat deceptive, and not to go too sideways, but I feel this relates to what Rob Gray talks about in his book, How We Learn to Move, describing elite or expert movers, all of them moving very slightly different. But if you grab an average of, for example, a golf swing, you get certain angles at joints. None of the experts would use any of those angles, but when you average it down, that's the average best ideal technique, which when we look at the amount of hours practiced, some may have practiced way more, some way less, but when you average it all up, you get this number in the middle, which could be around 10,000 hours. And so the average not representing any of the individuals, but the group of individuals. Very different. David and many other people have also discussed about the monotonic benefits. If two people started from scratch, each put in 1,000 hours of deliberate practice, they should be at the exact same performance level. But of course, as we know from various elements of research, that's not true. Everyone starts at a different point and everyone will develop at different rates, despite deliberate practice being deliberate practice. Us labeling the practice that's deliberate is going to be different when it comes to the skill development of each individual working in there. But this myth and the nuances inside of deliberate practice and the 10,000 hours rule are applied in practice potentially ineffectively or harmfully is when it comes to youth development or coach education and early specializing, because deliberate practice might be the best way to improve certain individuals, but is that going to be the most effective at the younger age groups or at the start for novices? Not necessarily. Just as a reminder, deliberate practice is effortful, not immediately rewarding, not inherently enjoyable, and needs to be relevant to overall performance improvements. Okay, you might be thinking, yep, children might not want to be doing deliberate practice right at the start, or novices might not want to be doing deliberate practice right at the start, especially all the way through the session. But this also applies to those in the investment years of their skill development, the elite performers, because fatigue impacts the amount of effort you can put into your practice. And so sometimes you don't want to be doing deliberate practice because of the level of fatigue of the individual. Maybe the session or the day or the week has been very long, and so inside of strength and conditioning, we would term this periodization. We want to periodize their energy levels, and so deliberate practice might actually be ineffective for their skill development or their investment inside of the training. In a later book named Peak, Ericsson talks about 3 different types of practice: deliberate practice, purposeful practice, and naive practice, all with different goals. Some people may want to just practice so that they're good enough to compete at a comfortable level with their friends at the park or wherever. Some people may want to focus a little bit more on something in specific, maybe a free throw or a penalty or certain juggling skills, freestyle skills, not for performance at the high level of a sport. And so whether you're in the sampling years or the specializing years or the investment years of skill development, the goal, the intention of the practice may change. Which brings me to the 2 points that I feel are missing from this conversation in most of online discussions that I've seen personally. For deliberate practice to be useful, I feel it depends on how we're measuring expertise. Are we measuring expertise in that one attempt, or that last 10 minutes, or that part of the session, or that session as a whole, or the week, or the month, or the quarter, or the year? Like, where are we starting and stopping our measure for whether it is expert practice, whether it is the right development, right skill, right movement for what it is that we as the coaches want, but them as the performers want? And so as an ecological performer, I would ask, what is the intention of the practice? Maybe the intention of the practice is to explore something and make loads of mistakes so you understand how to develop moving forwards, which relates to the bike study I discussed previously about the balance bike versus the training wheels. The balance bike having lots of variability, lots of mistakes for someone to correct and learn from, which is why the balance bike seemed to be faster for learning than the training wheels. And then the larger question about us as coaches, academics, teachers, researchers, about the labels and categories we put on things, who decides if it's deliberate practice or not? Is it the coach? Is it the performer? Is it the parent that's watching? Is it the club owner that's watching the session? Who decides it's deliberate practice? Because before we had the name deliberate practice, individuals were still doing deliberate practice. It was practice. So when I mentioned the measures earlier, is that part of the session deliberate practice, and then that part purposeful, and that part naive, and who is labeling it? Do we need those labels, or can we look at a session and see the intentions of the individual, see the attentions of the individual shift, and the skill development move forwards because they are trying hard, they are trying to improve, because that is what fun practice is. I enjoy Malcolm Gladwell's work. Yes, he's a journalist talking about research science and sports coaching and learning science and cognitive science, but it's still a voice that I use to reflect upon and really critique my ideas. But I feel this 10,000 hour rule should be retired. It should be left behind because it doesn't represent deliberate practice and the elements, the components that build up effective deliberate practice. But what are your thoughts?